We have a lot to learn on the topic of addictions and recovery, so join us for a conversation with one of Minnesota's leading experts in the treatment of addictions, next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. Tonight we're going to talk about some of the hottest topics in addictions and recovery, including the opioid heroin epidemic, medication-assisted treatment, and as many other topics as we can get to. And I have the perfect person here with me tonight to have that conversation with us. And you can be a part of the conversation tonight too by calling the numbers on your screen right now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. And my very special guest tonight is Gary Olson, who's worked in the field of addiction since the late 1960s and since 1992 has been the CEO of the Center for Alcohol and Drug Treatment. He's a recipient of the Lifetime Achievement and Leadership Award from the Minnesota Association of Resources and Recovery and Chemical Health. Thank you so much for coming here tonight. And his resume reads as a Charlie Rose resume. I had one of those moments of we're not worthy, we're not worthy. We are so fortunate not only to have him on the show, but the real fortune for this community is that he is in our community, because he could be off in some big city doing his thing, but he's right here doing his thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I think a great place for us to start, Gary, would be just for what is addictions? And I think we need to get all on the same page about that.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of different models of addiction, and there have been a lot of different theories of addiction, but basically it's any substance or activity that people use and continue to use despite harmful consequences. So it doesn't have to be a drug or alcohol. It could be gambling, it could be other kinds of behavior, but the key feature is compulsive use, loss of control, and again, continuing to use despite harmful consequences.
And I know that there are some people who ascribe to the notion once an addict, always an addict. And what is your response to that statement?
Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think, we recognize that addiction is a chronic problem. So the kind of the underlying thoughts and attitudes and behaviors that go along with addiction can persist and do persist long after people stop using a particular drug. So what we find is that some people may conquer one addiction and find themselves in the middle of another. And so, until people are in recovery, which is really different than just abstaining from a particular drug, recovery is a complete change in attitude and behavior based on self-awareness of those patterns of thought and behavior that have led to the problems that you had that caused you to quit the use in the first place. So some people, don't move on to other addictions, so it's not automatic. And the reality is that some people may look like problem users at one point in their life and not another point in their life. So it's just not quite as clear cut as we once believed.
There are some people who, and we hear this a lot, of people who go into treatment and the person who enters treatment and who is just looking for a way to become, say, a social drinker. So let's say they have an alcohol use problem and they're not looking to be on a complete abstinent model, and they're looking for a way to be a social drinker. There are a lot of people who say that's a slippery slope. You're not going to go from drinking a bottle of wine a night to just being a social drinker. Is social drinking possible for people?
Well, it's a question that a lot of people asked me when I worked in detox for 17 years, and there, the kind of standard answer was, well, give it a try and see how that works for you. So if people really believe that that is possible for them, they can try. It's risky, and there's risks associated with any use, not just for an addict, but for anybody. Use of alcohol and drugs poses a certain level of risk. So, some people, may experiment with that and try that. It's not a skill that we're teaching people how to drink socially, but there is evidence that some people are able to, again, go from problem use to what we would consider social use, or at least controlled use. But a lot of times people end up asking, what's the point? It's really easier in some ways to abstain from something that's causing you problems than it is to moderate it. So, it's true with certain eating. I have a thing about caramel rolls, and I'm a diabetic, so abstaining is easier for me than trying to eat just one. So.
I think the other thing that I've often said to people as well, and this sort of ties into the comment that you made, is that there's a difference from abstaining and being in recovery, and really addressing what are the underlying maintaining mechanisms of the addiction in terms of the behavior, in terms of how you interact with other people, and that you may need, in order to, if your goal is social or controlled use or drinking, you may need to be abstinent for a while in order to address all of those other features that are supporting the addiction. And what would your response to that be?
Yeah, I think we often confuse abstinence, sobriety, and recovery. Sobriety really is a commitment to abstinence. So people that have made that commitment, that's their goal. And for many people, maybe most people who have a drinking problem, that's an appropriate goal for them to achieve. It's just very difficult for some people. So there has to be, options or opportunities for people who are either unwilling, unable, or not ready to make that change. And it is those underlying patterns that really are critical in recovery that people have to become self-aware of. So, and some of it's an issue of consciousness and being more aware of your own patterns and your own behavior.
So you don't at all, then it sounds like, ascribe to this sort of one-size-fits-all. If you're not doing abstinence, then you're not in recovery kind of model.
Well, I think what people don't understand is, addiction is very, very common. It's as common as diabetes. So, and I think most people do know that it doesn't have a particular demographic. So it's as wide as our community in terms of the people affected. So we have people from lots of different backgrounds with lots of different coping skills and strengths and vulnerabilities. We have people that are deeply involved in an addiction where it has, serious biomedical issues and psychological issues and social issues, and people who are just experiencing some problems. We have people that are highly motivated to change because they've tried to quit. It's very rare that an addict hasn't made an attempt to quit or cut down and failed at that. So a lot of people that come into treatment are looking for abstinence because they have determined that's what they want, and they've tried and failed, and we can help them with that. So there's that. So we have people that are highly motivated to change, and people that we see in treatment who are only there because someone forced them to be there, or they made a choice between going to jail and going to treatment, and that's okay too. But those people, to imagine that there's one approach that's going to work for a population as broad as that is just unrealistic. So what we've done is look at really a person-centered approach. So we're looking at people and what their goals are in their life and how their use is affecting their life and their goals. And once you can establish that, then the motivation to change comes naturally.
What can we help people who are either court mandated into treatment or who feel mandated because of family members or because they've just gone through a quasi-TV style intervention with their family?
Yes, I think there's, the evidence is a little mixed on that. I mean, there are some studies that indicate that voluntary and involuntary are really not good predictors of outcomes, that people that are even in treatment involuntarily sometimes respond as well as people who are, quote, voluntary. But I think the problem is really knowing what's voluntary and what's not voluntary. So even though people make that choice of going to treatment instead of jail, doesn't mean they're really involuntary. And that sometimes people need a break from the pattern, a vicious cycle of addiction where you're no longer using for the enjoyment of it, you're using because you need to function. And they need a break from that to really assess where they're at. So for those folks, even if they don't perceive it as voluntary at the beginning, often during treatment, they begin to, again, understand more about the problem, are educated about the problem, and self-identify as, yeah, that really is me, that is really something I need to change in my life. And so they go from being an involuntary client to a voluntary client. So again, it's not possible to just make a blanket statement that one is better than another, but and we work with people wherever they're at, whether that's voluntary or involuntary.
I think you make a really good point, though, which is that people can, if you're entering treatment and your brain is highly addicted, one of the things that treatment can provide from you is your brain gets a break from that, so that you can give your brain a chance to come a little bit more back online, as we would say, and have a little bit better capacity to begin making decisions about, is this the kind of life that you want to lead?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the effect on the brain of alcohol and drugs and even gambling are very persistent. So depending on again the level of involvement with the drug. So somebody that's had problems that drinks periodically but has a lot of problems when they drink are not necessarily physically dependent and so forth. But the other thing we know is that some drugs, especially alcohol, actually affect the brain physically. So people's ability to control their impulses erodes over time as they drink more and more. I mean, even moderate alcohol use causes some brain shrinkage. So there are some things that are irreversible and some where you just need that time. So yeah, that's exactly right. Is people who have some period of time that are abstinent have a much better ability to take a clear look at what their involvement is with a chemical or an activity in their own life.
I think we still have a lot of people in our community that have a hard time believing that addictions are illnesses per se or affect the brain, and so this becomes sort of a matter of, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you were stronger, this wouldn't be an issue for you. So talk a little bit for us really about how addictions affect the brain.
Well, there is this idea that it's about choice. And the fact is, we become addicted without ever making that choice to be addicted. It may be a series of decisions over a very, very long period of time. And the roots of addiction are just like any other chronic disease. I mean, in the program just preceding this, we heard about, a peripheral artery disease, and they mentioned smoking, and they mentioned exercise, and they mentioned lifestyle. And really, there's this biological, psychological, social aspect to most chronic diseases, which is why addiction is called a disease. But it confuses people because it doesn't look like other diseases. But what we do know now, and the advances in addiction research have been really remarkable in the last 15 or 20 years, particularly in neuroscience. So what we understand now is that addiction is actually a modification of the reward system in the brain. So it's the same system that the brain, every brain has. So it's, sometimes we call it a brain disorder, but really it's the brain doing exactly what it's designed to do, which is to respond to a positive reward or stimulus or something that's pleasurable by telling itself, you know what, I need some more of that. And so alcohol, drugs, even sugar triggers this dopamine release in the brain. It's a neurotransmitter. And that neurotransmitter is about the wanting or the desire. So it really is the more you use, the more you want to use. And so it's a change in the way the reward system, sometimes people say it hijacks the reward system. And I think that's simplistic, but it's fair. And those changes are persistent. So that's what I mean. Even when people abstain, those changes are persistent. And then the other factor is some people are dopamine reactive. So and that makes them far more vulnerable to addiction. So there's this genetic aspect
to their to the hijacking
that's,
of their brain.
That's right, because they're reacting more powerfully to dopamine, and what that means is that when person A takes a drink, their desire to have another one increases. But when somebody with alcoholism takes a drink, their desire skyrockets. So the reaction and this is below the rational thought process, and so it's really occurs very, very deep in the brain, in the mammalian part of the brain rather than the primate part of the brain. So
it's in our dinosaur brain.
Almost, yeah. I mean, it's a little bit of the reptile and a lot of mammal and the primate too, you know. And I often use a slide in my presentations that shows, you know, chimpanzees with a cigarette smoking habit. So they can even develop addictions and dependencies. So.
And I think like some of that concept of well, it must be a choice, these other people just make the wrong choice, is if you're a person who doesn't have problem, say, let's use alcohol as an example. If you can have a glass of wine one evening, and then maybe a week and a half later, then you go out and you have a glass of wine, then that feels like an active choice that I'm making. I can say no, thank you. I don't want a second one. And what you were just explaining was that there is this biological difference in sort of I'm kind of interested in a second glass, but I think I'll say no because I'm going to drive home, versus the person who has the skyrocketing effect.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that confuses us, because we live in a place where a lot of people drink. 65% of adults drink alcohol. That leaves about 35% that don't drink at all, which is kind of interesting. But 65% of the people drink alcohol, but we know probably something around 10 or 15% of those people will develop alcoholism. So most people don't, and there's always a question of why is that? So that's when we get into these biological, psychological, socio-cultural factors that make someone more vulnerable to addiction. One of the most prominent ones that's just being really explored now is childhood trauma. The relationship between childhood trauma and alcoholism is a direct linear relationship. We don't understand the mechanism by which that happens, but I would say personally, if there was one thing we could do to prevent addiction, it would be eliminate childhood trauma, because I see the correlation, and I've been seeing it for 45 years, the correlation between childhood trauma and addiction.
And we do know that one of the factors at least playing a role in that is that certainly complex childhood trauma elevates your biological system, and so that you've got this hyper-aroused system, which makes people feel very, very uncomfortable in their skin, to the point that you'll do almost anything to get rid of that physiologic sensation. And we know that alcohol and drugs can kind of give you a break from that.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's the self-medicating aspect of drugs and alcohol, and I'll tell you, alcohol seems to be the drug of choice for people with trauma, including PTSD. They gravitate toward that, and the only thing I can conclude is it works for them, at least temporarily. But in the long run, it's a really poor drug.
Yes.
Because it may work in a short-term basis, but over a long period of time, it dramatically increases your risk for addiction, but also all the other physical problems associated with alcohol use that compound over time. So long-term alcohol use, we know now, that we've been hearing recently that the mortality rate amongst white middle-aged people is has dramatically increased, or increased significantly, mainly due to alcohol use. So there is a long-term effect from that. So it's not a good medicine, but yeah, people do self-medicate, and it's something that we need to consider when we're talking with somebody with an addiction. including things like methamphetamine, where a lot of people with ADHD are attracted to that drug because they actually feel better and more focused when they're using it, and that is the drug that's prescribed for ADHD. So the fact that they end up on that drug illicitly might account for some of that.
Yep, even though we know that most people who are prescribed ADHD will not go on to become methamphetamine.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Methamphetamine addicts.
Right.
Now I want to talk a little bit about, because I said that we would talk a little bit about this whole concept. Do we, first of all, do we have an opioid heroin epidemic here in the Northland?
You know, I've resisted calling it an epidemic just because I think that term is sometimes thrown around loosely. But I would have to say, yeah, we really do, especially in this part of Minnesota, in St. Louis County, Carleton County particularly. The numbers I looked at, and this is just people entering treatment for primary opiate dependence or addiction, is about 3 times higher than it is in Ramsey County on a per capita basis, and Carleton County is about 6 times higher than Ramsey County. So we definitely have an opioid problem. It's not just heroin, of course, it's also prescription drugs, and for a long time this part of Minnesota has been right at the top in terms of the number of prescribed opioid drugs as well.
So is there a reason why the Northland is attracting more of the heroin usage than down in the cities? Because for some people that would seem counterintuitive.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a real explanation. I mean, we see people that are using heroin now that historically or in the past were using other drugs like methamphetamine, and it's the availability,
supply and demand,
but the accessibility and availability of drugs does have an influence on that. I mean, we see these cycles of drugs. The meth epidemic a while back never really amounted to a lot in terms of numbers, but it was really destructive. And you know, I just want to mention too, by the way, that you know, we can talk about addiction kind of clinically, but the reality is the collateral damage from addiction is just horrible for not just the individual, but their family and for the community. So I understand why people get alarmed by addiction and are looking for a way to address it, for no other reason than the collateral damage that addiction causes.
And the collateral damage that we often see is really made clear to us in family members who just often they feel at a loss, they feel taken advantage of, they feel like they've been done wrong, often by family members who are addicted.
Well, that's right. I mean, when people are addicted, I mean, they make promises they can't keep to their loved ones when they, you know, that won't happen again, or that won't ever happen, and then they violate that trust time and time and time again, and eventually it becomes totally destructive of relationships. And at the same time, and this is something that people could think about a little bit, is they make promises to themselves that they can't keep, and that really has a negative effect on your self-efficacy, your belief that you are capable of control and changing your life. So it really works both ways and has real profound consequences.
Here's a question, Gary, and we're only going to have time for one because we're really running short on time here. Is there such a thing as an addictive personality?
No. That's been pretty much ruled out. If there were such a personality, we ought to be able to predict who's going to become addicted or not. And the fact is, we can't. It's about exposure. So if you expose 100 people, a certain number are going to become addicted. And the personality type, with the exception of psychological temperament, like risk-taking, which is a temperament thing that you're born with, there are some of those, but that's not really personality. And so no, that philosophy or that theory has been pretty thoroughly debunked.
And so, because we're running short on time, and we're not even going to get to one of the topics I said that we would get to, which is medication-assisted treatment. And I knew that this is what would happen when you have a genius on, then you only get to like 2 topics. And so we'll have him back. Don't worry, we'll have him back. But there are people out there right now. There are people out there with addictions who are watching, and there are family members.
That's right.
Who are watching. And so tell me what you want to say to them.
Well, I always tell family members their number one, if they have a person with addiction in the family, number one is to protect themselves. Don't allow their lives and their families to be ruined by an addiction. All stages of addiction are treatable, and if they do anything, it's to help that person get to someone that can help them, a treatment program or a professional that can help them. So that's what they should do. If people are wondering about their own use, if they're struggling with their use, treatment is not like it was 20 years ago. So come and talk with us or talk with a professional, and I think you'll find out that we have a lot we can offer, a lot of help we can provide people that are struggling with addiction.
There's hope. And that's the final message here, because I wanted to run this down as close to that mark as I could, so that we could hear as much from Gary as we did tonight. There is hope. Don't forget about that. And what he just said, all stages of addiction are treatable. Thanks so much for joining the discussion this week. And don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links. Join us next week when our topic will be alternative paths to well-being, following that less traveled road. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.